we go.
Okay, I'm starting this off. My name's Carol Ewell. I work for the Forest Service for an enterprise team called Adaptive Management Services. We're under the Washington office. I'll be the first speaker today, followed by Erin Noonan-Wright, and she works for the Wildland Fire Management Research, Development, and Applications branch. And then Nicole Vaillant, who's actually our project lead for the grant, is going to be the third speaker. She works for WETAC, the Western Wildland Environmental Threat and Assessment Center. Also, we worked on this project with Allie Reiner and Scott Daly, who are on the webinar today with us. A little tiny bit of background is we've actually all been working together for 10 years. We began together with AMSET under Joanne Feitz as field workers collecting data for this project. And about 6-7 years ago, two of us used pieces of the data set for our master's thesis. So I guess I just wanted to say we're really passionate about monitoring in this project and its current use and hopefully its future uses. So going to the project background, this project began in 2001 in the Pacific Southwest region, or Region 5. Definitely the focus was monitoring. Initially began just as prescribed fire treatments, and then we added mechanical treatments as well. Began with about 50 projects on all the national forests in California and multiple vegetation types. Excuse me. Then the focus began to be narrowed just to conifer-dominated systems under the grant project that began in 2009. We lumped treatments into two categories: mechanical treatments, including a thinning followed by a surface fuel treatment, and those could include mastication, on-site or machine piling, piles that may or may not have been burned, or off-site biomass removal. And then the fire treatments were only include prescribed fire treatments, not pile burning, so we're thinking broadcast burning or underburning. So a little bit further background was that Nicole Vaillant and others published in 2009 two different papers that were the inspiration to continue this project, and they only looked at pre- and post-1 data, and some of their results are outlined on this slide. The effects of fuels and forest structure, they looked at prescribed fire reduced surface and ground fuels. Mechanical treatments increased the 1 to 100 hour fuel categories, but the impacts on the remainder of the categories were mixed. Mechanical treatments removed more trees and altered stand structure more than prescribed fire. And the effects on potential fire behavior was that prescribed fire always reduced potential fire behavior, but the results from mechanical treatments was mixed. So building from the 2009 publications was the grant, and it had 3 different research objectives. We're going to cover all 3 objectives in this presentation, but we're primarily focusing on objective 1, which is to determine the length of time fuel treatments are effective at reducing undesirable fire behavior. That included measuring effects of fuel treatments on stand structure and fuel loads over time, also modeling fire behavior with custom fuel models. Objective 2 quantified the uncertainty associated with the use of standard and custom fuel models. And the third one, assess prescribed fire effects on carbon stocks and validate modeled outputs. So for our methods, we used a subset of the data. It only included 14 national forests with 28 fuel treatment projects that totaled 88 plots sampled through multiple time periods. The slide shows it was broken down into 47 prescribed fire plots and 41 mechanical plots. So we did repeated measures over time of the exact same plots in the exact same place. They're monumented out in the forest with tree tags and rebar. So throughout this slide, you're going to see P00 as the symbol for pre-treatment. 1 year post, 2 year post, and post 08 was P08. We actually did gather data at the post 5 and the post 10 intervals, but those were our smallest data sets, which makes them unreliable for consistent results or tight results. So the next few slides continue to talk about methods. First, we talk about field sampling. It was based on the National Park Service Monitoring Handbook. We had random plot locations within each treatment. Up to 6 plots were located in each treatment, and they were divided into detailed and fuels plots. The main difference is that detailed plots have trees inventoried in them. There's a graphic on the next slide that will illustrate this. Okay, so what was gathered in these plots is sort of outlined here. The detailed plots are similar to the National Park Service plots. They just have a different plot shape. So there was 3 circles of tree data, the overstory trees being the outer circle, pole-sized trees, and seedling trees. The diagonal lines were the fuel transects, if you think in the Browns lines. And then the vertical and horizontal line was the shrub transect and the herb quadrats. We put this slide in here to show that we actually do have a couple different plot styles. And starting in 2003, when plots were installed pre-treatment, they took a different format here, showed on the right side of your slide. The reason why we changed our format was to speed up data collection and also to capture more variability across the treatment area. So in the early years, we only had 3 plots per treatment area, and then we increased that to 6. And that was in the pre-treatment interval. What was actually captured post-treatment was potentially a subset of that amount of plots. So for our calculations, we calculated dead fuel biomass using the California constants. Live fuel biomass was calculated using the Firemon constants. Canopy metrics were calculated with the FFE FVS, which is fire fuel, the forced veg simulator. I'll let Erin explain that acronym. I'm stumbling now. Okay, so the canopy metrics we calculated were the canopy base height, which you're going to see CBH throughout this slideshow, and also canopy bulk density, CBD, and tree density. Nexus was used for fire modeling, and we created custom fuel models from the field gathered and calculated values, and we used 90th percentile weather conditions specific to each treatment project. Third part of our methods was the statistical analysis. The plots were stratified by treatment and dominant forest type, as listed here. So the mechanical treatments were broken into 3 groups, mixed conifer, yellow pine, and red fir. And the prescribed fire treatments were broken into 2 veg types, mixed conifer and yellow pine. And for statistics, we used linear mixed models. So this slide illustrates our sample size, which was unbalanced. Let's see if my arrow works here. It shows a larger sample size for the pre-treatment, which is somewhat shrinking through time as we get to the post-8 treatment cycle, or the plot rating cycle. The reasons for this was there was not enough time since treatment for some plots. So not that many years have passed since they've been treated. A retreatment or a maintenance treatment has occurred on some plots since we began monitoring them. And that complicates our study because we were looking at the longevity of the initial treatment. Wildfire actually burned a few of our plots. And then for 2 years, this study was unfunded, and I think it was 2007 and 2008. And so we didn't collect data during those years. We wanted to make the point also that this was not a research study. It was definitely a management implicated treatment, and this was a monitoring type study. So we weren't able to have each plot, continue through time based on its treatment history. I think that's it for me. I'm going to hand it over to Erin, and they can also chime in if I forgot to say something on one of my slides. Thank you.
Thanks, Carol. So I'm going to talk about the custom fuel modeling and why we chose this approach to assign measured fuel loads to fuel models. We did an analysis of this data set in 2006 and used one of the 13 Anderson or 40 Scott and Bergen standard fuel models to represent pre- and post-treatment fuel loading. For that analysis, fuel models were subjectively chosen by a qualified F-band, so somebody that was familiar with fire behavior, that looked at pictures and data, and then they selected a fuel model. Since that time, the Fire and Fuels extension to the Forest Vegetation Simulator, and at this point I'm just going to refer to this program as FFE, developed methods to objectively assign measured surface fuel loads either to a custom or one of the 53 standard fuel models. So we decided to test this approach to see how different predicted fire behavior would be if a custom or standard fuel model was chosen to represent the fuel loading on a plot. Okay. So generally what we found is that overall there was pretty good agreement in predicted fire behavior regardless of what fuel model method was chosen to represent the fuel loads. Using a subset of our data just for the prescribed fire plots, we had FFE assign a standard fuel model and create a custom one, simulate a wildfire with approximately 90th percentile fuel moisture and wind gust, and report the predicted surface fire flame lengths. We compared output for all time periods and generally found similar trends, and this was encouraging in that if we did choose to use custom fuel models for the entire data set, the predicted fire behavior wouldn't be so different than fire behavior generated from standard fuel models, which are more commonly used to represent fuel loading pre- and post-treatment. So after going through this preliminary analysis, we decided to use custom fuel models for the entire data set, and we developed them using a similar approach to FFE. So one of the benefits of using custom fuel models was that the predicted fire behavior more closely followed fluctuations in fuel loading, which we thought was more realistic. But there were some caveats, and the most important being that with the custom fuel models, they're not calibrated to observe fire behavior. So the real utility in these outputs is being able to evaluate relative changes in fire behavior as a result of treatment, not absolute. So as an example, I wouldn't necessarily expect pre-treatment surface flame lengths to be 2 meters in the field, but I would feel comfortable saying that there was a decrease in fire behavior 1 year after treatment. And so if you want more information regarding this, we actually have a paper coming out in Forest Science that gets into a little bit more details. So with that, let's talk about the treatment effects and longevity. One of the main objectives was to determine the length of time fuel treatments are effective at reducing undesirable fire behavior. And we did this by measuring the effects of treatments on stand structure and fuel loads over time, and then modeling potential fire behavior with custom fuel models. So we are going to present the data by treatment and overstory forest type. And the first one is a mechanical yellow pine combination. This is a photo time series from one of the mechanical treatments on the Tahoe National Forest. This was a mastication treatment. In some portions of the plots, the willow has aggressively resprouted, and by post-date you can actually see clumps of the willow that's over 12 feet tall. Okay, so we have 5 graphs here, and I'm just going to sort of explain the setup of these slides because this is how we're going to describe our results. So the first graph is forest floor, and it's in megagrams per hectare, which is the same thing as metric tons per hectare. And forest floor is a combination of litter and duff loading. The next graph is a summation of the 1, 10, and 100-hour fuel loads. Then we have the 1,000-hour fuel loads, and then we have understory load, which is a combination of live and dead herbaceous, live shrub, and seedling biomass less than 6 feet tall. We have the sample size up here in the box, and then we have a box plot that shows just the surface fire flame length. So Carol sort of touched on this a little bit, but I want to reiterate with the methods. we used custom fuel models, and then we ran them through two fire simulations in Nexus. The first simulation, we just forced only surface fire. And the reason we did that is we wanted to isolate the effect of the treatment on just surface fire only. And this allowed us to use all of our plots, because we had all of our plots, we measured surface fuels, but only a subset we had measured canopy. So this way we could use all of our plots, and it also sort of removed some of the vagaries associated with crown fire modeling. Then we ran another simulation in Nexus, and we enabled crown fire so that the plots where we measured canopy could result in some sort of predicted crown fire, and we could talk about that, and we'll do that on the next slide. We also did some statistical testing amongst for these different variables, and so the variables with the same letter mean that they're statistically significant at a P of 0.05 significance level. So in this example, pre-treatment forest floor wood loading is statistically significant from 2 years after forest floor loading. That's why A and A. I'll just explain that so that we're all clear on that. So generally speaking, with the mechanical yellow pine combination, the trends where we saw an initial increase in the 1 and 10, 100, or the 10 and 100 hour fuels primarily, even though this is 1 to 100, and then we saw a steady decline over time. Over time, we don't see much of a change in the surface flame length, and you can kind of see that here. By 8 years after treatment, we start to see a little increase in litter, and we start to see a sort of a recovery of the understory load, and that's sort of contributing to a slightly higher on average surface flame length, but not a real strong trend there. And not surprisingly, you know, the big story with the mechanical treatments is the effect on stand structure and fire type. So, you know, for these graphs, we've got poles and overstory, and then canopy base height and canopy bulk density. And then this is looking at fire type and the percent of plots that have predicted either crown or surface fire. Crown is a combination of passive, active, and conditional crown fire. So with the mechanical yellow pine, we see a huge decrease in the number of poles, and that's resulting in an increase in canopy base height right after treatments. Likewise, we see a big decrease in the overstory trees, and that's also resulting in a decline of the canopy bulk density. Subsequently, we're getting more plots that are having predictive surface fire right after treatments. And that sort of continues over time. We still have a number of plots here, though, that have crown fire, even after you've gone through and done the mechanical treatment and have done the thinning. And I think this is related just to the fact that we still have some surface fire that is still pretty high, at least enough to initiate passive torching. And so a lot of this fire by post-8 and even post-2 is passive crown fire, where you have enough surface fire intensity to still initiate some type of crown fire. Okay, so the next group is the mechanical mixed conifer. This is a photo time series from the Stanislaus National Forest, and this was a thin from below. All diameters less than 18 inches were removed with a biomass slash removal for the 4 to 10 inch diameter classes. Tree and slash were removed off-site. And so although the material from the thinning was moved off-site, you can still see some of this residual fuels left behind in the pictures. And then the other thing that is, I guess pretty apparent is just the understory vegetation that starts to come back even as early as 5 years, but really, really evident 8 years after treatment. So the forest floor, we see a decrease post-1, and this is mostly due to a decrease in duff with the compaction associated with compaction. The 1 to 10 100-hour fuels, again, we see the biggest decrease, or the biggest increase here right after treatment is in the 10 and 100-hour fuel loading. Understory load starts to increase even above pre-treatment levels by 8 years after treatment, which is which isn't interesting. We saw that in the pictures. And so what this means overall for surface fire flame length is, again, not a big change over time. We see a slight decrease in litter loading right after the treatment, but litter sort of recovers by 8 years, and so we start to get pretty similar flame lengths to pre-treatment levels by that time period. Again, similar to the yellow pine mechanical treated, we have a decrease in the poles leading to an increase in canopy base height. We have a decrease in the overstory leading to a decrease in canopy bulk density, and so subsequently we're getting more of the plots with predicted surface fire post-treatment. We do start to see a decline in the amount of plots with predicted surface fire by 8 years, and again, that's reflecting an increase in litter loading, an increase in understory vegetation, a slight decrease in the canopy base height, and we're getting more passive crown fire starting around that time period. Okay, and so the last mechanically treated group is this mechanical red fir. This is a photo time series from the Lake Tahoe Basin. All the plots were thinned, less than 30 inches, and the fuels were chipped along 200 feet along the main road. Otherwise, the fuels were piled and burned everywhere else. You can really see with this particular treatment that they removed the larger diameter trees, and there really weren't any pole-sized trees to begin with. So you're not going to see that effect, at least in this picture. Okay, and then here's sort of the data. It's similar to the other mechanically treated areas, not a big change over time. The difference for red fir is that there isn't really a recovery in the understory load like there were in the other vegetation types. And this overall is generally the lowest flame length compared to the other vegetation types. I think, again, just reflecting that there's less litter available and less fine fuels, which, this surface fire is very responsive to the fine fuels. And as far as the mechanical treatments, pretty similar to the other vegetation types, a decrease in poles, a decrease in overstory. We get more crown fire right after, more surface fire right after treatment. This trend is, it's encouraging, but I can't help but note we've only got a sample size of 3 there. So whether this is real or not, I wouldn't expect it to go down, but this is reflecting 3 plots that just have really low surface fuel loads and surface flame lengths, and therefore they're getting more surface fire and less passive and active crown fire. So overall, just to really summarize the big picture with the mechanical treatments, we're generally seeing an increase in the 10 and 100-hour fuels right after treatment. But by the time we get to 8 years after treatment, the 10 and 100-hour fuel load is pretty similar to pre-treatment level. We're seeing a negligible change in litter right after treatment, but by about 8 years after treatment, we're seeing a pretty strong increase in litter. The one exception would be the red fir type didn't see those type of increases. Consequently, the surface fire flame lengths, they have these kind of competing forces in terms of fuels, and so you're really not really recognizing a treatment effect as far as surface fire. This is not all that surprising. The real story with the mechanical is just the effect on the overstory and the trees and the resulting fire from doing that kind of thinning. So the mechanical treatments resulted in less canopy bulk density post-treatment, and that remained pretty constant through post-8. There was an increase in canopy base height, and that reflects the decrease of poles and per hectare post-treatment. And overall, it's resulting in less crown fire overall, but we're starting to see more passive crown fire creep back by about 8 years after treatment, just from an increase in fuels and decreasing canopy base height by around that time. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Nicole Vaillant, and she is going to talk to you about the prescribed fire types.
Thanks, Erin. The next few slides will follow the same trend that Erin just set up, so it's similar format. So this is a prescribed fire treatment in Jeffrey Pine Stand on the Modoc National Forest, which is northeastern California. I wanted to point out really how the prescribed fire affected some of the larger trees within the plot area in later years. So you can see post-8, if I can get my pointer working. Post 8, you see the addition of this large snag had fallen over within the plot area, and by post 10, we have another large snag being added. This shows us that really long-term monitoring is needed to understand the effects of fire on tree mortality specifically, as well as the other factors we're looking at, and then to see how these trees die, either stay as standing snags or if snags are being added to the large surface fuel load in later years. So these graphs highlight the fact that prescribed fire decreases the fuel load in all the categories the first year after treatment. So we're seeing a decrease in the forest floor as well as the 1 to 100,000 and the understory fuel load. So this is different than the mechanical treatments, which had increases in some of these. So when we look at the total fuel loads, the sum of all of the different loads together, we find that the total fuel load returns to about 75% of the pretreatment levels by that 8-year post-treatment read. The surface fire flame lengths kind of follow the same general trend, where we have an initial reduction in surface fire flame length, which is pretty consistent between post 1 and post 2. But by post 8, we're getting surface fire flame lengths that are about equivalent to the pretreatment levels. So with the similar to the mechanical treatments, prescribed fire also increases the canopy base height and reduces the canopy bulk density relative to the pretreatment levels. However, the change is not nearly as drastic as was seen in the mechanical treatments. I'd also like to point out that there was a continual decline in tree density for both the pole-sized and the overstory trees. And we didn't define this earlier, but a pole-sized tree is 15 centimeters or less, so about 6 inches in diameter, and overstory trees include all the trees greater than that diameter. We're also seeing, like we saw in the picture, a continued decline in both pole trees and large overstory trees over time through post 8. So the change in the stand structure and canopy characteristics do also increase surface fire potential post 1 and post 2. And then by post 8, we're starting to get close again to the pretreatment levels as far as percentage of surface fire and crown fire. So both the surface fire flame length and the crown fire potential are becoming close again to pretreatment levels within the yellow pine prescribed fire treatment types. So next we have mixed conifer. These pictures are from a prescribed fire treatment on the Klamath National Forest. Again, I wanted to point out the addition of large trees falling down in later years, so this is post 8. And just as a side note, these plots are within the burn-only units of the fire surrogate study. They weren't the same plots within that study, but within the same units themselves. So again, to look at fuel load, the effects of prescribed fire mixed conifer is similar to that of yellow pine, with an initial reduction from treatment, followed by an increase, again, reaching about 75% of the pre-treatment levels by the post-8 year. Within the most mixed conifer type, the average post-8 flame length does actually exceed the pre-treatment value, not by a whole lot, but it is higher than the pre-treatment value at this point. One thing that I found of particular interest is looking at the understory load. When we're at the post-8 value, it's double what it was pre-treatment. So we're having a large recruitment of understory vegetation, which is primarily in the shrubs, even though it's all live fuels combined at this point. So next, the fuel loads have similar effects on stand structure, fire has similar effect on stand structure as yellow pine. The increase in canopy base height and decreases in canopy bulk density are reflected in the lower incidence of crown fire for the post 1 and post 2 time periods. But by post 8, you can see the recruitment of full-size trees and the decreasing as the canopy base height, which does start to decrease the potential of crown or surface fire because those full-size trees are coming in. There's a higher incidence of passive crown fire within the area. So just to summarize the prescribed fire effects, we're going to reiterate some of the trends. Fuel loads were initially reduced, but then returned to about 75% by post-8. The understory fuel load exceeded that of pretreatment by post-8 and was actually about double the initial value in mixed conifer. The increases in fuel load were reflected in the surface fire flame length, where it exceeded or equaled pretreatment by post-8. This was primarily driven by increases in the litter load and live fuel loads, which Erin kind of touched on how that affects surface fire flame length. Some of this isn't too surprising, given the fire return interval in yellow pine and mixed conifer forests across the state kind of range from as short as 2 years in really dry yellow pine sites, or potentially as high as 50 years in the moisture mixed conifer. Our sites were typically in drier sites and would be characteristic of the shorter fire return intervals. Stand structure was not as heavily impacted by prescribed fire as mechanical treatment. We did find, though, that delayed mortality in both forest types at the post-8 level compared to post-1 and 2 was interesting, and it indicates a need for longer-term monitoring to see how fire affects the different mortality rates of trees. Also, we saw the increase in canopy base height and slight reduction in canopy bulk density did reduce crown fire potential for the first 2 years, but by 8 years post-treatment, this was somewhat diminished. So what does all this mean? I wanted to point out one thing, that we are unique in the fact that we have data at a regional scale, and that it also includes long-term monitoring of repeated measures. There's very little research at this point that includes information beyond 1 or 2 years post-treatment. We also have data from 3 different vegetation types and two treatment types, although our mechanical lump everything. We do look at prescribed fire and mechanical treatment. We think that even though we have a lot of variability in our data, it can be useful and helpful to help inform the planning process. So, for example, the increase in the understory loads, which happened in both the mechanical and fire treatments, and was primarily from shrub ingrowth, indicate the potential need for retreatment. The amount of live biomass is higher post-8 than it was prior to treatment. However, at this point, the live to dead ratio might be higher because the shrubs are younger, and they potentially also have a higher fuel moisture content, which could impact fire spread and fire intensity. One thing to point is when we modeled all this through Nexus, we assumed fully cured fuels, so our fire behavior might be a little higher than expected, but we're not sure, given the persistent drought in California, that this might not be the case. Maybe the fuels will be really dry and very susceptible to fire. One thing too, even though the fuel loads were back to 75% in the prescribed fire burning, this indicates a potential need for retreatment, although a lot of that was that understory load recruitment. Also, mechanical treatments resulted in increases in the 1 to 100 hour surface fuel loads, and we feel that these would really benefit from some follow-up of prescribed fire. Although we didn't have plots that had a combined treatment being prescribed fire and thinning together, we think this is likely the ideal option for fuel treatment prescriptions and planning. It has kind of the best of both worlds, where you are impacting the forest structure that really impacts the crown fire potential, as well as doing prescribed burn to reduce those surface fuel loads. We fully understand that challenges exist when completing prescribed fire, and it might not be possible in every situation, but we do feel that using non-fire techniques alone don't necessarily mitigate the complete risk or hazard to fire because of those elevated surface fuel loads. And also, mechanical treatments alone do not meet restoration goals. You do need fire to have the effects of fire shown within the area. We also think that there's potentially a need for more intense prescribed fires or an increased use in fire use. Because the prescribed fires that we had were spring and fall, they were fairly mellow burns, cooler burns, so they didn't have the consumption rate that you'd have in a wildfire. We only consumed about 50% of the surface fuel loads within, and we didn't actually have a large impact on stand structure. We also found that subsequent burns are needed to maintain the longevity of the fuel treatment effectiveness, and luckily they're often easier and cheaper than the initial entry. And from our data, we're saying post-8, post-10 years would probably be an appropriate time to go in and retreat. So one thing we want to say is we have a plea for more monitoring. There isn't a lot of long-term monitoring data out there, or at least that's publicly available and shared. You really need to understand how fuels change from treatment over time. We have a fairly good understanding of treatment effectiveness initially after treatment via multiple studies in the literature. However, we don't know as much about the longevity of the treatments. There's also a need for monitoring beyond the scope of what we have. We only look at prescribed fire and mechanical treatments. We don't look at the combined treatments. We look at very limited forest types within California. But again, we really want to say, monitoring is really an integral part of understanding the science of fuel treatment longevity, and it needs to look beyond the first year or two. One thing we noted is you really don't see the delayed mortality until later years with the monitoring data. We also want to support FFI. It's a Fireman Feet integrated tool. It is a great resource to archive and analyze data. It is used by the Department of Interior, so that would be Park Service, BLM, and Fish and Wildlife have a lot of their data in that database. We have also archived our data there for use of folks, and we just think it's a great tool to be able to archive and look at your data. So future monitoring, outlook on this project. Even though the Joint Fire Science Grant is done at this point, we're going to continue monitoring our plots. We'll be back in the field this summer looking at 24 of the plots that are up for primarily post-8 reads, some are post-5. We also would really like to expand the scope of the project within California and throughout the West. So if there's anybody on this webinar that has data that they'd like to add to this study or are willing to share, please let us know and we'll figure out how to incorporate it and also archive it in FFI. So future work, we want to continue using the existing data set and any other monitoring we have to look at the fire effects, so to really see how fire affects tree mortality long term. We've got information that we didn't mention, but we gathered char, scorch, torch, and severity when we were in the field after treatment. We'd also like to look at vegetation response to see how treatments affect species diversity, recruitment of alien species such as cheatgrass and whatnot. We're also open to other ideas that might have management implications to help answer questions for management. So I'm going to completely switch gears a bit here and talk about our third objective, which was to quantify changes in carbon stocks over time and to validate modeled outputs using our field data. So we used a subset of the prescribed fire plots, which you can see in the image here. All of these plots included pre-treatment, post-1, post-2, and post-8 data. So it's a balanced data set, which was great after coming from the monitoring data. And so we first looked at changes in carbon stocks over time, and then we looked at validate model outputs from FFE. So for this slide, I don't expect people to check it out, get all the numbers, etc. But for a quick rundown, we quantified carbon in 5 pools using our field data. So that would be trees, live trees, dead standing trees and snags, both included the appropriate roots with them, an urban shrub pool, surface fuel, which is 1 through 1,000 hour fuels this time, as forest floor again, which is litter and dust. And then total biomass is the sum of the above 5, and then we also simulated a wildfire in FFE to quantify the wildfire emissions. So the take-home points from this is that treatments did significantly reduce total stand carbon biomass between pre-treatment and 1 year post-treatment, and also that the simulated wildfire emissions were significantly lower for all post-treatment years than the pre-treatment values. One other note is that by 8 year post-treatment, the total biomass, less the potential loss of carbon from wildfire, exceeded that of the pre-treatment levels. So what we're finding is by 8 years post-treatment, if a wildfire to occur, it's actually a carbon sink. So, and then this slide is where we did the comparison of our field-derived carbon stocks, which are on the y-axis. And we compared that to simulated carbon stocks from the Forest Fire and Field Extension, from Forest Vegetation Simulator on the y-axis. All the different points are the points for all the different time periods within each carbon pool, which are the same as the prior table. And what we did is we took the pre-treatment field data, simulated a prescribed burn in FFE, and then allowed the stand to grow forward to compare what the simulated values in FFE were to the field-derived values of carbon. So like the prior slide, each panel is a separate carbon pool. The diagonal line within each is a line of perfect agreement. So points that fall within the line or close to the line are highly correlated, and if they fall farther away from the line, they're not very correlated between the field-derived and the simulation outputs. So we found that both the total biomass and tree biomass to be highly correlated, meaning that the simulated values are very accurate to what we found in the field. However, we found the snag and urban shrub pools to be less correlated. We found that FFE overestimates the presence of snag carbon and did a poor job of estimating the carbon within the urban shrub pool. The lack of correlation between the simulated and field-derived carbon and the urban shrub pool is not unexpected. And it's not unexpected because FFE doesn't actually utilize input data from urban shrubs, so it did not use our field data to calibrate the model. So kind of in sum, what this tells us is that overall FFE does a good job of estimating total carbon biomass because it accurately predicts the carbon stored in live trees, but it does not do so well when looking at all the individual pools. So it should be used with caution if you want to look at specific pools for carbon loading like surface fuels, but if you're looking at a total stand, it is a good tool for that. So with that, we'd like to acknowledge a group of people and then open it up for questions. So we'd like to acknowledge the Region 5 Fire Aviation and Management for funding the project from 2000 to 2006, and then Joint Fire Science from 2009 till earlier this year. We definitely need to thank Joanne Feitz-Kaufman, who initiated the project and obtained the funding for the first 6 years, and she's the reason a lot of us actually work for the Forest Service. This project could have never been completed without the fire, fuels, and GIS, silviculture staff, etc. from all the forests involved. We also want to have a special thanks to Kevin McCrumman and Todd Decker, who are our lead field members. Sylvia Mori and Ben Rao both helped with statistics for all the different questions we had within the study, and John Crotty and Nate Benson for supplying funding and their time to import our data into FFI. We also would like to invite you to check out our 2 websites at your leisure, and with that, I'd like to say thank you for the group, and we'd like to open it up for questions.
Thank you, Nicole, and Erin and Carol as well. Yeah, I'll just open it up again to questions. Like Nicole said, feel free to type them in. I just switched to a different sort of screen, so the chat box is now on the sort of top, closer to the left-hand side, so you can type in your questions there. And we had one question about average plot sizes and slope, which was already answered in the chat box, but the average plot size was 0.1 hectares or a quarter acre, and average slope range from 1 to 55%. So I actually have a question while folks are typing any more questions in, and that's, did you see any difference between, because you had plots that were in the, ranging from the Klamath down to the Southern California forest, if you saw any meaningful distinctions between your results there and what the implications for managers in those different areas could be?
I guess I'll field this. This is Nicole. You know, there was a lot of variability amongst our plots within different vegetation groups, and at first we tried to look at everything as a lump sum just between prescribed fire and mechanical treatments and realized that wasn't possible. But I wouldn't say the variation between a dry pine site in Southern California was that much different than a dry pine site in Northeastern California. So there were some differences between regions, but it wasn't striking. We did look at that before we did our vegetation or forest type groupings for the analysis.
Okay. See a couple folks are typing in now. Anyone else, please get those questions in. We have a question from Susie. Is anyone measuring soil carbon? And how do you deal with the unknown quantity of soil carbon? Is it standard to just assume that soil carbon is the same when treated or untreated?
That's a really good question. Can you hear me? This is Allie Reiner.
Yes.
I could let Nicole speak on this too, but yeah, the soil carbon is unknown and it's not really dealt with in FFE. So maybe I'll have Nicole speak on that. We just used a standard quantified percentage from the literature, but I think that's a big question because there's a lot of research going on right now about soil carbon and how it's affected by fire and the unknowns of black carbon, which is produced by fire and has longer, it's more has a higher longevity. So yeah, that's a really good question, and I think we should look at including some soil sampling in the future, and particularly black carbon sampling. But that adds another facet when you have to send soil samples off to a lab for some pretty extensive analysis. And Nicole, did you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, I'll just add that, like Allie said, soil carbon is not considered in the forest vegetation simulator, nor did we actually measure it within the field. The FFE, or Fire and Fuels Extension, is not an all-inclusive carbon accounting system. We also didn't include information on carbon as far as, fuel to get out there to transport, biomass off-site, to drive out to the site to do the prescribed burns, or the fuel associated with, actually implementing the treatment, so the machinery, gas for the machinery and whatnot. I do believe soil carbon is very important, and it accounts for, a little less than half of the total carbon within the forest ecosystem, but unfortunately, the methods we used were not able to capture that information.
Thanks, and I see there's a number of people typing in more questions, so while they're getting those questions typed up, I'll just point out that in this box underneath the chat box, there's links to this project's homepage and a PDF of their final report. I'll also email those links out in the follow-up email. And there's also a link to an evaluation survey for this webinar. We do this with all our webinars, and it helps us to get feedback and give feedback to the speakers. So the way all of these links work is you click on the link and click the Browse To button that shows up. It's a little clunky, but that's how it works. So thanks for doing those. And we do have a question now from W. Grau, and it's, were you able to validate FFE post-burn mortality models with the 8 to 10 year remeasurements?
So when we did that assessment, I guess we didn't really look at post-mortality without looking at carbon, although you can kind of equate the two together. We just found that often FFE had a higher mortality rate than we were seeing in the field, but we also didn't calibrate FFE when we ran it. We let it use its default values. So I bet if we used our field data to calibrate it, it would be more accurate, because oftentimes we had no snags within the field, or very few, and FFE was assuming that there were multiple snags, or at least biomass and snags via carbon. So although it's not a direct validation of FFE, I feel for our data, it kind of over-assumed mortality with the 8 to 10 year measurements.
And this is Erin. We do have plans to look a little bit more into the mortality data and some of the longer-term post-fire effects, but we haven't gotten there yet.
All right, and we've got another question here from Patrick Doyle at the Lassen National Forest. He's saying, caution has been expressed in using the FFE-FVS carbon extension for surface fuels. Would this still be something to be cautious with if using it to model surface fuel treatments that do not have a lot of herbaceous herbs or shrubs in the units?
Yeah, I would use some caution, because from our scatter plots, you could see that it didn't fall along that line of perfect agreement. I'd have to look back at the numbers to know how different it was. And I think it was within 10 or 15% of what we found in the field, which actually isn't too bad, but I'd need to verify that to be sure, and I can follow up with you, Patrick, later.
And as far as modeling the surface fuel treatment outside of the carbon, you know, that is a big limitation of FFE-FES, is that you can't use your measured values for herbs or shrubs. That's something that's sort of dubbed in. So, you know, that's something we emphasize too in terms of the custom fuel modeling as well. But if you don't have a lot of herbs and shrubs, and you do have measured fuel loads, you know, that you know, it could be a really good fit. It could be a useful tool. But just use caution if you do have a lot of live fuels in the understory.
Okay, and we have another question here from Malcolm North. Hey, Malcolm. He asks, are there any plans for second entries at these sites? The relatively rapid return to elevated ground fire potential and high surface flame lengths seems reasonable, given the initial high fuel loads, but I wonder how many treatments and types you need to buy yourself a reduced fire intensity in line with historic regimes.
So I'll start to answer that. There actually were a number of sites that were retreated, and we have data for that, but we didn't present it within the final report or this webinar, just because our sample size was so low. And we would like to look at that, but there are also future plans for other sites to go back in. So I know there's 2 or 3 projects that had planned. Some were prescribed burned initially and are going to be thinned. Others are having a second thinning. Some have gone back to have a second burn. So it's, you know, great news that there are retreatments happening, and how those affect the fuel load, since they were high to start, we're not sure yet, but we do have some data to look at that. And I don't know how many treatments we'd actually need to do to reduce fire intensity back to a historic regime. Our initial, at least the prescribed burn treatments, only reduced the surface fuel loads by about 50%, and the mechanical treatments increased it. So it would depend on the treatment type, as well as, I believe, the vegetation type and the reaccumulation of surface fuels.
Okay, and we've got another question also about repeated entries from Jamie Rosen. He asks, do your results indicate a certain time frame when a re-entry would be recommended or necessary to maintain fuel treatment effectiveness? If so, how variable is the recommended re-entry time frame based on site-specific factors? In the late 90s, the Forest Service was sued for failing to address in its NEPA documents the effects of fuel break maintenance. And the outcome of that litigation was largely based on the court's agreement with the plaintiffs that fuel break maintenance would be needed every 2 to 5 years, and this is in Sierra mixed conifer.
I guess I'll take this one too. So I would say that our results indicate that by 8 years post-treatment, we would recommend retreatment or maintenance fuel treatments to maintain the effectiveness. In prescribed burning, that's primarily because those surface fuel loads and understory live loads are coming back up to about pretreatment levels, and the surface fire flame length is reaching or exceeding the pretreatment levels. We also think that the mechanical treatments would benefit from retreatment. My opinion is the retreatment and those would best be prescribed fire to reduce those elevated fuel loads, but we were seeing a higher incidence of crown fire potential by 8 years post-treatment in those mechanical treatments as well, although we weren't seeing much of a change in surface fire flame length due to mechanical treatments.
And this is Erin. You know, I think that's a tough question too, because, you know, we are looking at our data on a regional, you know, on a regional level, and so certain areas are going to be, based on the actual treatment that was implemented, are going to respond differently. As Carol had mentioned, you know, we do have remeasurement data at 1, 2, 5, 8, and 10, and our post-5, we definitely start to see an increase in the fuel loading, but we don't have a ton of samples for that time step, and so we didn't want to report it here necessarily for this presentation. So we're definitely starting to see that trend of the recovery of the fuels at 5 years, and a very strong trend at 8. And then the data that we do have for post 10 is also just showing continuing fuels, higher fuels, and subsequently, greater fire behavior. So, yeah, I mean, I think overall we can say, we can make generalizations. Definitely by 8 years, probably a good time to think about retreating. But yeah, I just want to say, you got to take caution a little bit because it is going to be site specific. Yeah, but I guess that's all. I don't know if anybody else anything else they want to add.
I can jump in too. I mean, with the interest in second entry information, we do have a little bit of that information, a couple sites, but we didn't have enough sites that it would have like statistical strength in order to be publishable data. But if folks are interested in that, maybe before we close out this project here, I'll just volunteer us to do something else. Maybe we could like summarize that in some sort of a white paper, just as we can, even though we don't have a lot of plots like that, and get that out to folks.
All right. Well, yeah, those intersections of law and science can be tricky. And there's no good answer or no clear answer for everywhere. Well, thanks to all of our speakers and for Ali for joining us for the question and answer. And with that, I guess we'll bring this webinar to a close. And again, I'll follow up with an email. I'll include the contact information of all of the speakers. And yes, thanks everyone for joining. Thanks for the questions. And thanks for the answers.
Thank you for letting us do this.
All right. Have a good afternoon, everyone.